Have you ever sat across from somebody that you love? Someone who says they love you and felt like they were holding your heart hostage? And one minute you were arguing about something real, something that hurt. And the next minute you're spiraling into a panic because they've threatened to walk away again. And maybe they said something like, if you're gonna act like this, I don't even know if we should be together. Or something like, I can't keep doing this. I'm done, I'm out. And just like that, your brain switches from conflict to survival. And you're no longer thinking clearly. And you're no longer thinking about the original issue. You're just trying to stop the bleed. You're begging, you're appeasing, you're freezing. You're doing anything not to be left. And I want you to know that's not communication. And that's not resolution. What that is emotional blackmail. And it's often rooted in abandonment wound. And what most people think emotional blackmail looks like is do this or I'll leave you. Or something like act right or I'm gone. But here's the truth. It's more subtle. It's more emotional. It sounds like pain and it looks like a threat. And it feels like love mixed with fear. And sometimes it's said in a whisper and sometimes it's said in silence. Stonewalling, withdrawal, the cold shoulder, packing a bag, and heading for the door without warning. And it always leaves you with this unspoken contract of if you disappoint me, I'll abandon you. And as human beings, we are wired for connection. And from the time we were infants, we rely on others to regulate our sense of safety. And when a caregiver disappears, either emotionally or physically, what happens is our nervous system goes into overdrive. So now fast forward to adulthood. After experiencing childhood where your emotional caregiver disappeared either emotionally or physically, then you develop an abandonment wound. And an abandonment wound means that if you learned early on that love could leave you, then someone threatening to leave doesn't feel like a conflict to you. It feels like death. So when someone threatens to walk out, you don't just feel sad. You feel terrified. You feel unworthy. And you feel like you have to earn a way back into love. And this is why people in emotionally blackmailing relationships often say that I lose myself just trying to keep them from leaving. Because when abandonment is the core wound, your fear of loss will overdrive your sense of self. So let's slow it down. The abandonment wound often starts in early life when a caregiver was physically absent either due to death, due to divorce, due to work, due to illness, due to addiction, or they're emotionally unavailable, either numb, reactive, distracted, or cold, or they were just inconsistent where sometimes they're warm and then sometimes they're rejecting, and you never knew who you were gonna get. And because of this can leave a child with a confusing message that love is conditional. And they can develop this belief that if I'm not good, quiet, perfect, or pleasing, that they'll leave. So then what happens is that child becomes hypervigilant. And you watch for signs of withdrawal. You people please. You self-abandon to avoid being abandoned. And by the time you're an adult, this wound shows up in relationships as intense anxiety during conflict, a fear of being too much or not enough, settling for crumbs because you're scared of being alone, and panicking when someone threatens to leave, even if you actually know that you're being manipulated. So when someone threatens to leave, especially during conflict, they're not just expressing pain. What they're doing is leveraging your deepest fear. And they're not just saying, I'm upset. They're saying, I'll punish you with my absence unless you comply. And this is how emotional blackmail gets wired into your nervous system. And then what happens is you start avoiding real conversations. You stop setting boundaries. You accept mistreatment. Because in your mind, anything is better than being left. So what happens is over time, that creates an unsafe relationship dynamic where one person holds the power and the other person lives in fear. So yes, emotional blackmail is often rooted in the abandonment wound, but that does not make it okay. Because threatening to leave in a conflict, if it's a repeated pattern, is a form of emotional manipulation. And sometimes it becomes emotional abuse. So understanding the root helps us heal, but that doesn't excuse the behavior. And we can be compassionate towards someone's pain without tolerating being hurt by their pain. So if you're someone who says, I'll just leave, when things get hard, I want you to please hear this. That threat might be a defense, and you might be so scared of being rejected that you reject them first, and you might be trying to feel powerful in moments when you feel small. And you might be reenacting your own abandonment, trying to take control this time. But here's the truth. What you're doing is you're not creating safety. What you're doing is creating distance. And what you're doing is reinforcing the exact pain that you are trying to avoid. And in the process, you're damaging the relationship's ability to survive hard moments. And if you're in a relationship where you're being threatened repeatedly, I want you to know it's not your job to fix someone else's fear of abandonment. It's your job to protect your own heart. So if you feel like you've been manipulated into staying in love, and if you feel like leaving has been used against you, I want you to know that you're not weak and you are not broken. You are just human and you deserve to feel safe and love. So I want you to know, emotional blackmail does not always sound threatening. Sometimes it sounds like guilt, and sometimes it sounds like silence, and sometimes it sounds like, you would do this if you really loved me. The truth is, not all emotional blackmail is loud. It's not always someone yelling, I'll leave if you don't ... Sometimes the quiet ache in your stomach when you feel punished for having boundaries, and sometimes it's the unspoken rules, like you're not allowed to say no without consequences. But most of the time, it follows a pattern. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 common forms of emotional blackmail. And I call them the 4 faces of emotional blackmail. And when you know how to recognize them, you can start to reclaim your power. So let's get started. The first one is called the punisher. So what this one looks like is, do this or else. And this one is the most obvious form. This one is a person that threatens consequences when you don't comply with them. And it can sound like, if you don't go to my family's house with me, then don't bother coming home. Or something like, I can't be with someone who doesn't support me, so maybe we're not right for each other. Or something like, if you talk to your ex again, then I'm leaving. And the punishment from the punisher can be physical distance, the threat of ending the relationship, or even emotional withdrawal, where they pull away affection or love to control your behavior. The core belief of the punisher is, if you don't do what I want, I will hurt you, either emotionally or relationally. And what happens is that this creates a fear-based compliance, not a real connection. And what it does is teaches your nervous system that love is only safe when you're obedient. Another form of emotional blackmail is called the self-punisher. And this one looks more like, fine, I'll just suffer then. And this one's a little harder to spot because it sounds more self-sacrificial. But what it is still manipulation. And it shows up as, no, it's fine, I'll just be miserable. Don't worry about me. Or something like, I guess I'll just go alone then. Or it can sound like, just forget it. I'll handle it myself like always. So here the person isn't threatening to hurt you. They're threatening to hurt themselves if you don't comply. And what happens is that it creates this silent pressure of, if I don't give in, they will suffer and I'll feel guilty. So what happens is this form of emotional blackmail hijacks your compassion and turns it into control. The next form of emotional blackmail is called the sufferer. And this one looks more like, look what you did to me. And the sufferer is more built on shame. And this person makes you feel bad, not by threatening you, but by showing how hurt they are. They weaponize their pain to control you. So some examples of how this sounds is, you're breaking my heart. Or something like, I guess I never mattered to you. Or I can't believe you would do this after everything I've done for you. Their tears, their sadness, their collapse, it all becomes your responsibility. So what happens is you start to think, if I say no, they'll fall apart. And if I don't fix this, then I'm the bad guy. So this is more a shame-based tactic that preys on your desire to be good, kind, and loyal. And over time, what happens is it erodes your ability to trust your own needs. The fourth form of emotional blackmail is called the silent threat, which is more like you just know you messed up. And this one is the most covert form of emotional blackmail because there are no threats, there are no words, there are no accusations. There's just this vibe. They pull away, they become cold, distant, or they just shut down completely. And they leave you guessing, what did I do wrong? And they make you chase after them for reassurance. And this tactic is so dangerous because it's invisible. And you don't even most of the time realize that you're being manipulated. You just feel like you're always walking on eggshells. And eventually what happens is you start anticipating their withdrawal before it even happens. And you start adjusting your behavior to avoid their coldness. And you start self-abandoning before they can abandon you. And that's how emotional blackmail becomes internalized. And because these tactics work, they give people short-term control in the middle of emotional chaos. And many people who use emotional blackmail are not trying to be cruel. What they are doing is trying to avoid feeling powerless because they don't know how to regulate their emotions. They don't know how to sit in their own discomfort. And they don't know how to communicate their pain. So what they do is they manipulate instead. but the intention behind the act does not erase the impact of the act. And when these patterns show up, even in good intentions, they damage the foundation of trust, safety, and mutual respect. So how do you break the cycle? So the first step is awareness. And awareness is naming what's happening. And if any of these phases of emotional blackmail feel familiar to you or sound familiar to you, whether you're on the receiving end or doing them yourself, that's not a reason for shame. That's an invitation to heal. Because what you couldn't name before, you can now set boundaries around. And what you didn't recognize before, you can now protect yourself from. And what you used to call normal, you can now start calling what it really is, which is unsafe, unfair, and not love. And emotional blackmail, what it does is it rewires your attachment system. So when someone keeps threatening to leave you, or pulling away from you every time you say no, or go silent every time you set a boundary, your nervous system doesn't just notice it, it memorizes it. Because your attachment system is wired for survival, not logic. And if love starts to feel unsafe, and if connection becomes conditional, and if you're punished for showing up as your full self, then your brain starts reorganizing itself around one single priority: to avoid abandonment. So let's break down exactly how this happens. The first time someone emotionally blackmails you, it can be jarring. And you might think, wait, did that really just happen? But over time, the repetition makes it predictable. And predictability, that's how trauma works its way into your nervous system. And your brain starts to associate someone else's disappointment or disapproval with danger. And you feel a threat, not to your body, but to your connection. And for a person with attachment wounds, especially around abandonment, that can feel just as terrifying. So now every time you set a boundary, and every time you say I don't agree, and every time you don't bend to their emotional demands, your body, what it does is screams, fix it, please them, just make it stop. And without even realizing it, you start choosing peace over truth, and connection over being your real self, and self-abandonment over conflict. And this happens without you even realizing it. And then what can happen is that you start feeling responsible for other people's emotions. And when that happens, this is when codependency begins to take root. So you're no longer managing your own reactions. You're walking around constantly bracing for theirs. And you scan for mood changes. You shrink your needs. And you rehearse your words to avoid triggering theirs. And you keep asking yourself, how can I keep them happy? Because when emotional blackmail is chronic, your system learns that other people's emotions are your job. And that's not love, that's a fawn mode. And that's your attachment system doing everything it can to prevent another disconnection. And one of the most painful consequences of emotional blackmail is that it starts to erode your internal compass. So then you start thinking and questioning yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's my fault that they're upset. Maybe I'm selfish for setting that boundary. And you start second guessing yourself so much that your body becomes a war zone, where your fear of abandonment is fighting with your need for self-respect. And then you don't know what's true anymore. You just know it hurts. And that confusion, that's by design. Because what happens is that emotional blackmail thrives on ambiguity. And it thrives when you're unsure of your worth. And it thrives when you're too busy blaming yourself to notice when someone else is manipulating you. And eventually what happens is that this becomes your baseline. This becomes your normal. And you start believing this is just what love looks like. And maybe you grew up with a caregiver who did this, who guilted you, threatened to leave, or made their emotions your responsibility. And maybe every partner that you have had followed this pattern. And so now you're not shocked when it happens. You're just exhausted from it. And instead of asking, why are they doing this? You ask, why can't I get this right? But here's the truth. You were never supposed to be in a relationship where love meant losing yourself. You were never supposed to feel scared of being left or of having needs. And what you're calling normal is actually a trauma adaptation. And what you're calling love might be your attachment wounds playing dress up. And what eventually happens is that your system eventually hits a limit. And you either go numb, where you're feeling disconnected, checked out, emotionally distant, or you start to rage. And this rage doesn't always happen outwardly. Sometimes it happens just in your head. But you start thinking things like, why do I always have to be the one that fixes everything? Or why can't I just say how I feel without being punished? Or I'm so tired of pretending like I'm okay. And listen, that anger, that numbness, that shut down feeling That's not a problem, that's a signal. It's a signal that your nervous system is letting you know that this is not sustainable and something has to change. So how do we begin healing the abandonment wound? And before we jump into healing, I want to say something that might surprise you. You're not broken, you're not weak, and you're definitely not too damaged to have healthy, secure love. You are just a human being whose nervous system adapted to survive abandonment. And those adaptations, they've kept you alive. They've helped you navigate dangerous emotional terrain, and they've made you resourceful, attuned, and sensitive. So let's approach healing not with shame, but with compassion. So what's actually happening is that the abandonment wound shows up fast and it's sneaky. Suddenly your partner pulls away and you're spiraling. Or they criticize you and you're feeling like you're 7 years old again. Or they say something like, maybe this isn't working, and your body goes into full panic mode. And when this happens, the very first healing move is to name the wound. I want you to literally pause and say to yourself, this is my abandonment wound talking. I'm not endangered, I'm triggered, not broken. And when you name it, what happens is that it creates space and you interpret the panic and you invite your wise adult self back online. And with practice, the space gets bigger and the spiral goes slower and you get stronger. Step number 2 is to stop betraying yourself to keep others. And this is the hardest part, because when you've been emotionally blackmailed, you've learned to abandon yourself before someone else can. So you over-explain, you apologize for having needs, you say yes when your body is screaming no, you forgive things that you haven't even had time to feel hurt over. But every time you're doing that, what you're doing is reinforcing the wound. So here's the practice. I want you to choose micro moments of self-honoring over self-abandonment. So what that might sound like is, I just need a minute to think before I respond. I understand you're upset, but I'm allowed to have boundaries. I'm not going to agree just to keep the peace. You can also do the counting backwards 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 before you even respond. And these aren't just boundary phrases. They're acts of nervous system rewiring. Because every time you choose yourself, even when it terrifies you, you're teaching your brain, I can survive disapproval. I can survive discomfort. And I can survive love that isn't love. And what happens is eventually you stop calling emotional blackmail love. Step 3, something else that you can try, is inner child work. Because your abandonment wound isn't just intellectual. It lives in your body, in your inner child. And that part of you, she doesn't need another relationship to fix her. What she needs is you. Inner child work isn't about blaming your parents. It's about becoming the adult that you always needed. So I want you to try this. When you feel panic rise up, imagine your younger self. Visualize her, maybe age 6, maybe age 7, alone in her room, scared that love will leave. And then I want you to say to her, you are not alone anymore. I've got you. And that may sound simple, but that kind of reparenting is profound. Because when you show up for yourself in moments where others have failed you, you rewrite the story. And you start to believe that you don't have to earn love. And you start to believe that you are love. A bonus step that you can take is to not let your wound pick your partner. And this one might sting a little. So I'm going to say it gently, but clearly. The abandonment wound will always pick someone who feels familiar. The abandonment wound will not pick someone who is safe and who is secure. And that's why so many people are stuck in cycles of emotional blackmail. It's because it echoes childhood. It echoes what is familiar. And healing means learning to recognize the pull of the wound and say, this feels intense, but it's not intimacy. This feels urgent, but it's not love. This feels familiar, but it's not safe. And healthy love might feel boring at first, but what's really happening is that your nervous system is just learning how to relax. And that right there is the beginning of freedom. And healing the abandonment wound isn't about becoming unbothered. It's about becoming resourced. And it's not that you'll never feel afraid again. It's that fear won't drive your decisions because you'll notice it, you'll hold it, you'll care for it, and you'll choose you anyway. And that right there, that's real healing. So I want you to imagine a life where you don't have to beg for love, where your needs are honored without guilt or fear, where your boundaries are respected and your heart can rest. Because that life is possible, and it just starts with you. Because you are the safe space that you've been looking for.